You are listening to a Clarkesworld magazine podcast. I'm your host and narrator, Kate Baker. Welcome to the third story for the month of March, 2026, issue 234. I hope that this is finding you as well as can be, all things considered. I want to thank you for spending the time here at Clarkesworld for a little escapism. I want to thank you for your ongoing support. Without your contribution via patreon.com/Clarkesworld, we can't do this. So thank you. If you're a subscriber, if you've gone to Patreon, if you've gone to clarksworldcitizens.com, or you've chucked a few bucks our way via a donation, every little bit counts, and I can't thank you enough. Our story is titled Crosstalk, Elysium by Carolyn Zhao. Carolyn Zhao is a speculative fiction writer and retired English major based in New York City and Chicago. Her work has been published in Clarkesworld and Strange Horizons. She loves her dog almost as much as her dog loves her. And if you like what you hear, please go back to Symbiotic and In Which Caruth is Correct. So, my dear listener, I hope that you can sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story. Tell me a story where it all goes right. Say that we only ever stopped at the station with the largest wingspan and busiest fuel pipes, the 50-something spears jutting out of its hull like enormous oars, the edges swarming with lights from all the other ships like Elysium, fighting for their places to feed. Tell me, when I squint, that I can still see it shine. Every few days, as we swing around the orbit again, the faraway station hull glimmers like a secret in the long, quiet dark. Whenever we pass it, I add another mark to the tally. 90. 91, 92. I count each orbit aloud just in case, but it never works because Elysium is asleep. It's broken in half, from the inside out. That's what Hearth used to say anyway. It's broken. Like a spaceship with something you just threw at the wall and couldn't put back together again. I don't really know what else to call it, though. Elysium is one long piece of corridor shaped like a U-turn, with a port on one end and starboard on the other, and the bridge stretching in a long open dead zone in between. I was on port next to the library and mess and the 34th engine. Hearth was below. Was. He named her Elysium because he never wanted to leave. I might not want to believe it, but Hearth doesn't lie. Elysium's his baby, you see. He found her when someone was selling the hull for junk. He bought her with half of everything he had, made it his project and his home. And when he took the rest of us on for maintenance and company and programming, he said that Elysium would be ours as well. But most of all, he wanted me to be his co-pilot. He wanted me and the ship to get along. And I told him I already liked the ship and that Maury was the better pilot by far. Ask her instead, not me. But Hearth only said, Dolly, the ship won't work with me on where to go. You'll give it a chance whether you like it or not. I became Elysium's pilot 3 years ago. 3 is lucky in Canary, where Elysium is from. Maury told me that 3 is the minimum number of crew members required to fly a Carnarian ship, with the ship counting as the 3rd member, though it can't pilot itself. Back when we first met, I said there was no way I would work with Maury, even after we'd been out on orbit for months already. Maury pursed her lips. Hearth put his hand on the control panel and made his voice very calm and quiet. Maury's better than anyone we've found, Hearth said. So, we're going to put her to good use, I asked. Captain? Hearth's pulse didn't change, but his breathing did. I could hear it. After Maury left, he got me into Elysium's cockpit and told me to take us all to the nearest fuel station. I knew the orbits pretty well, but I still wanted to reconfirm. We hit the engine button and waited for the ship to respond. Sorry, I said. Don't be sorry. Do you still want to do the exercises? See what the ship says, Hearth said. Go on. If you can't be polite to your crew member, you may as well practice on your own. Try being nice. I'm awful at being nice, I said. You'll get better, he said, but I only did because he started telling me what to say. Before each flight, I had to ask Elysium a question before I got into the seat. Then I had to polish up the consoles and pretend to apologize to Maury and give the answer before I actually started the engines. That was the gist of it. Harth and I started keeping the questions and riddles in the ship's records so we could get Elysium to start quicker. I'm telling this all out of order. It's hard to keep track after so long, but I need to get the story out. Harth was always better at making riddles up than I was, even when I thought for longer about the questions. I think Elysium preferred him because it was Carnarian, actually, and everyone knows Carnarian ships play favorites. Maury said that Canary is one of those old star systems next to the other life ship cluster, Ballet, or Tide. I can't remember which. It's the one with triads, unlucky number 3s, which is how all Carnarian ships operate. The ships like rhythms or build-ups. They like getting questions right on the third try. This was why Harth and I chose to use riddles, though we spent a lot of time thinking about questions that were the right level of difficulty. A too hard question would leave us stranded when Elysium sulked. An easy one would start the engines immediately juddering, and we'd take off and break light speed before even setting a trajectory. Harth got a question right the first time we piloted together. I was nervous on the second trip because I burned up my best riddle the day before with 4 guesses. Harth sat in the cockpit, scrunching up his nose. Then he took out a small book from his pocket, the analog one where he kept his most beautiful riddles and stories, and said, "I have a tongue, but don't speak. You can feel my presence but never touch." He paused. I took a look over his shoulder at the book. "I consume but do not hunger?" I asked. "Something like that," he said. "So what am I?" We waited for Elysium to respond. It was silent in the cockpit, since we'd closed the door to the bridge. Harth tapped the pilot screen. The engines weren't humming. "Do you think it's too difficult?" "I don't think so," I said. "But maybe she doesn't know the answer because she's never seen it before?" "No," Harth said. "The question's not elegant enough. We have enough real fuel, so just write a couple of answers down and feed it to the logs when we're done." His voice got louder. "Elysium, do you want a hint?" It didn't. That was the secret. Elysium never wanted any hints, as Harth and Maury said, but it wanted me to answer for her and pretend that she was the one who had guessed right. If you said the wrong answer twice and then the right answer once, you'd be in play. It was important not to use the same riddle more than once. Harth said that was called redundancy, according to Carnarian intelligence theory, because if you lied too much to the ship about things it knew, it would start learning to make stuff up. The ships in Canary, for example, the fixed-up ships, the ships that ran perfectly, told lies all the time. They swallowed down a diet of questions and answers, of lectures and soliloquies, like that old story of the god who put his mouth to the ocean and drank the waves up out of thirst. The ships in Canary ate so many speeches and manifestos and poems that they eventually learned how to talk back and tell the future. Each ship knew everything about their 2 pilots, while the pilots had to come up with even more stories, sometimes in different languages, to make the ships curious enough to fly. The entire Canarian economy orbited around this system of storytelling because nothing could get anywhere if the ships weren't interested. I guess it was lucky we got a ship that mainly liked answering riddles. Sometimes we followed tradition and fed Elysium a couple of descriptions, like the way a lie could curl up in your stomach, like a cramp, or how the paint on the outer vents dried up into thick coats that we could peel off with our fingernails. After we fed her the words, we'd sit on our hands and wait for the engine to hum. I don't know if anyone in Canary actually paints their ships. Harth says he found Elysium at a junkyard on the outer rim, where it was being broken down for scrap. Apparently there was no Canarian code in the system, which made it incompetent for any kind of wayfaring. They only knew it was Canary by the carved 3-point insignia on its starboard side. But the rest of its paint had already been scoured off by space itself, the heat of the showers of detritus, and whoever ran it had left the ship in the dark on its own. Real Canarians don't abandon ships. Maury told me a story once, when it was just the 2 of us, that they blow their dead ships into pieces. It was merciful to kill a ship that had lost its pilots. In fact, there was a colony far away that was made completely out of dying ships drifting together in the black. They were intact until they weren't. A few years ago, the Canarians went and took them all apart. Their fleet needed the new material. The ships were deformed, and Canary itself was running out of steel, copper, organometallics, and all that scrap because they'd started a war. This was a long time ago, though skirmishes still break out sometimes around the fueling stations. But what happens was that the living Canarian fleet went to the colony of dying ships, and all the existing triad pilots talked together over the radio and agreed that there was nothing to do but slowly drag the dying ships free of the colony's orbit. They prepared a boarding party, speeches and all, and whispered to the dying ships that they could leave whenever they wanted, that a pilot-engineer dryad would be out there waiting for them, if only they could get free of this deadlock, this tangled orbit, this place where no ship was meant to die. For a few moments, no ship responded. They were deformed beyond belief, but the boarding party waited, each of them, on one ship, with their ears to the control panels listening for signs of life. The ships didn't respond until they did. One by one, their engines groaning, the ships jostled and dragged themselves out of the cluster and presented themselves to the living fleet and allowed themselves to be boarded, inspected, and later taken apart. But that'll never happen to Elysium, Harth told me afterward. That's not who we are as a crew. We're going to keep adding parts, not taking them away. Every now and then, when a Canarian ship ran low on fuel, Mori said the pilot and the engineer could talk it into going again. The ship would sulk and groan because it got so tiring carrying fuel around, and also it didn't want to do what it was told, but it could be convinced. When a ship wasn't convinced, you'd have to stay there in space until someone found you again. Then the crew would have to put out an SOS. If you were lucky, someone would talk their ship into going off course to follow the signal. And if you were unlucky, Mori said, that's where you'd stay until the universe ended. All Canarian ships need sleep when they're tired, or when the fuel is out, or when the pilot tells such boring stories that it's not possible to stay conscious. New Canarian ships start off sleeping until the pilot decides to wake them up. Elysium's wide awake now, I think. It can't go back to sleep. I'm trying to remember how it went. Mori used to come down to my room next to the 34th engine. One time after I got on board, she leaned back on the co-pilot seat and said, very lightly, "How long do you think we have?" Hello, I said. Don't talk as if she's not there, Harth said. Mori's the kind of person who talks to Harth when she thinks I'm not listening, though I always am. When Harth told her that, a few months in, she paused for a little bit, like she had tasted something sour. Then 8 hours later, when Harth was dead asleep, Mori came down to my room next to the engine rooms. She sat against the wall and started to tell a story. Not that anyone needs to hear it. She only told me lies. But even so, Mori kept going downstairs to talk with me. And in the first year, she kept tapping on all the intercoms on Elysium to see if I could really hear her even then. Of course I could. I could hear her even on spacewalks when she was out on the hull doing maintenance. So she thought I was following her even though I wasn't. What was the point in following someone all day? In the second year, when Harth started looking at her differently, Mori told me in the night that she thought he was a little old, and that while she was sleeping, she'd dream of visiting Canary one day, once we finally had enough money or food or chances or real liquid fuel. Enough fuel to last us there and back. Does Canary even exist anymore? I asked her. Of course it does, Dolly, she said. Can't you feel it? The ship can go home whenever it wants. I told her she was lying. She laughed and replied that all stories were lies in the end. You keep lying until your tongue gives out or your lungs or all that belief collapses underneath you like a thin rope bridge on its last bit of thread. After Harth and I got the engine started every day, Mori would bring me down to the lower decks and build us a world of our own, a world where Canary still existed, and where we didn't have to keep jump-starting the ship and hunting around for fuel in the dark. I could be sipping a sweet drink, fresh with crushed ice, I could be singing a song I'd learned over the radio or from an ancient sheet of music. I could be stepping into one of the showers, bathing myself in lukewarm water that misted out of the nozzles. Water that coated my skin like paint and oil. They were discreet about it. Harth and Morty didn't often leave the ship, even when we docked. Usually Morty would sing me something in the cockpit as Harth clanked around the engine room, prodding at Elysium's insides, like it couldn't feel anything in the slightest. I always felt queasy during these inspections and had to endure it as Morty read me the travel log for our next mission out into space. Those days, more and more, our cargo became packed full of scrap metal, spare parts, old and destroyed mechanical work, and meager medical equipment. The detritus of war. The detritus of a future. I'd stay awake at night at Harth's request, watching the dark, searing, cold reactor core. As soon as morning broke, I ran to the cockpit where Harth was waiting to talk to me. The core of the ship was quiet. Too quiet. I'd have to talk to myself to stay awake, and there was no world where I wanted that kind of work, that kind of story, where I was the only one there to tell it. But there's no one to tell our story now. I can't understand why things won't come in the right order. I have to tell the truth about Morty and the nights she kept talking to me in the dark. Oh, she was bad at storytelling, so roundabout and discursive. One night I heard Morty speaking. The neighboring fuel station orbited the sun while we were shipside, near the bright nuclear heart of the colony. Morty had leaned her body toward Harth after Elysium had been put to sleep, and she had begun talking in a slow voice. Harth was holding an oxygen line and rubbing the cap between his fingers. An orange light loomed through the loading docks, leaching its sallow way across the floor, and their bodies became silhouettes. I couldn't see either of their expressions anymore. "There's only so much time before she catches on," Morty said. "We've been lucky enough to make it so far. I don't want to keep taking chances." Harth didn't answer her, but he closed the oxygen cap and held the line casually, like he was about to loop it over his arm. I liked that he kept quiet. I liked that they didn't know I was listening, even though the entire ship was asleep. I had switched on the audio system without either of them noticing, but listening to them made my insides feel light and panicky, a sense of falling into a net that wouldn't hold. I was sure Harth was on my side. Morty was not, and throughout the story she told me there was a sense of holding back even at night, as if I weren't worth getting to know. But Harth knew me. Elysium listened to me easier than it did anyone else. And if I were the best pilot on Elysium, there would be no need for Morty to get rid of me in the end, and I was sure that Harth would understand. Morty was underestimating me after all. The oxygen line. That's what I forgot to mention. I forgot to say what we were carrying. Elysium carried hostages. Back when we were near the skirmishes around the stations, we'd picked up a couple of the stragglers when their ships were shot down in the field. When a ship went dark, you could either target the engines directly and destroy them or go for the oxygen tanks and leave the crew to suffocate. Sometimes when a ship died intact, we'd float over and offer any survivors a chance at getting planetside. More often than not, we'd be denied. A crew goes down with its beloved craft, but occasionally we'd find ourselves saddled with passengers who were grateful for oxygen and a cell. That was in the early stages of the war. Later on, there was no use rescuing enemy members because they were desperate enough to fight the rescuers, or even kill. The last year I was with Elysium, around the edges of a couple of skirmishes, we picked up 2 passengers, a spare Canarian engineer and pilot. The engineer was called Kel, and he was 63 and tired when he sent out the rescue signal. I never learned the pilot's name because she kept silent, even as we picked her out of the ship's corpse. She didn't try to plead for her life or explain why she abandoned ship. Some pilots are like that, happy to leave their ship behind. It was easy to talk to Kel, though. He was open, and his voice came in loud over the comms as Harth questioned him about loyalties and allegiances. The pilot, however, was totally mute. She'd be asleep most of the time we checked, and the only time she opened her eyes was when she heard Morty mention my name. "Dolly, is that what you call her?" the pilot asked. Maury didn't answer. I thought then that she just didn't hear what the pilot said. At the time, I had other things to worry about. Harth and Maury, for example, had stopped talking to Elysium entirely. Whenever we needed to start the engines, Harth sat in the pilot's seat with his arms crossed, waiting for me to speak. I would shrink from the prompting, but he'd prod me again into asking a question or answering it in Elysium's stead. The pressure tired me through, and Elysium seemed to answer less and less, slower and slower still. One time when I tried to ask a question, Elysium shut down completely, all dark. So dark that the lights went out at once in an enormous bang that echoed down the corridor. As I sat there terrified in the black, struck suddenly by an immense drowsiness, Harth laughed. You'll get there one day, he said. We just have to keep trying. Elysium wasn't meant to fall asleep like that. I'm not meant to sleep now, either. At that time, I also began to catch snippets of conversation through the comms. The passing ships talked to each other through space, asking questions and answering them. They wanted to know about the other craft, other paths through the dark. Sometimes I thought they were talking to me, saying things like, "How are you?" and "Where have you been?" I used to send signals out to them, saying that I didn't know how I was and to stop talking to strangers. I opened the comms sometimes because they were so loud. I thought that the more we listened, the less Elysium would sleep. It took a while to deliver the passengers through neutral space. One of the few times we stopped at a planet where the wind blew so cold that the ship froze up, we had to take a couple of weeks to find fuel that the engines could chew. The ship ran partly on ore, besides the work of cajoling and story spinning, so Harth pulled on a suit and opened the airlock and lowered himself down to the sand. The planet had sunk into an endless night, punctured only by the needlepoint gleam of 3 bright stars and the eye of a hesitant yellow moon. After Harth left, Maury curled up in her room and didn't come out. I heard her tapping through orders, instructions, delivery scripts, weight, and fuel calculations. The passengers still lingered below deck in their respective cells. Kel had begun a couple of long physical exercises, grunting here and there as he levered himself up and down against the floor and walls. The pilot sat cross-legged in the center of the room and didn't move. Her silence scared me, and I imagined the silence held severity, a towering rage, or an utter and terrible violence. On the 3rd day after Harth left, however, Kel was the one who pressed the comm button in his cell for the first time. Maury woke up when she heard the ringing. We made our way slowly down. You couldn't go into the cells. There was no telling what the passengers would do, so Maury stayed outside with the door magnetized shut. Kel gazed out from the other side of the glass, which mirrored us clearly, as if we were standing just next to him. Maury pressed the comms button. "Can I help you?" she asked. I was hoping to see the planet if you were amenable," Kel said. "I've heard the moon is particularly beautiful around these parts, is it?" "I'm afraid I can't do that," Maury said. "Captain's orders." "Just a quick look." His voice was gentle, slightly worn at the edges, and I could tell he was tired from the exercises. He couldn't break the magnet if he tried. Maury opened the control panel to the cell, the one that controlled the door, evac, and lights. "Dolly, are you listening?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Shut off the comms and go warm up the ship." I went to the cockpit and toggled the comms, switching back and forth between rooms. "If you keep the alarm quiet," I told Elysium, "I won't tell Maury that we listened in. It'll be a secret. You and I, partners together." The ship listened to me talk and seemed to consider the deal, pensive and patient. I turned on the comms and adjusted for the frequency of the cell until I heard Maury's breathing, the soft clangs of Kel walking back and forth on metal floors. The cockpit was lit by that moon. The frost had gathered around the curvature of its windows. All along the distance, white sand separated us from the gulf of the crevice, which was where Harth had descended. Any moment I expected to see a tiny figure clamber out of the deep, sanded earth, laden with ore. He would see the cockpit bright like an ember, and he'd know that I was waiting there. but I had time to open up the comms before he reached the ship. It was a simple flip of a switch. As I turned the dials, I coaxed the ship out of sleep with some riddles. I'd already come up with some new ones about distance and longing, and Elysium stirred like it was shaking off a dream. And I felt the cell's noise sharpen and clear. They were talking. There was no sound of argument, but the volume of Mori's voice. She was still close to the control panel itself. If needed, she could turn off the lights or allow the window between them to fall away. Kel's voice came calm and gentle. It had a coaxing tone to it like a grandparent's. I'd never heard anyone use that tone before, except in recordings I'd rifled through or in the various ships' voices that came wafting through space. Now the speech. Mori told Kel to lie down. Kel said he wasn't going to and that he was worried not about himself, but about the ship we were on. Elysium, he said. Is that what you called it? The ship of paradise. What happened next? Mori said that Kel should lie down again. She was very calm, even relaxed. Kel seemed to be grasping for leverage, a sign that Mori would engage or even listen in. But he couldn't find it. I can see them if I try hard enough. Kel slowly shuffled closer to the door with a hand up in trepidation, his passenger suit dull orange in the light from the window. Mori had leaned against the frame of the cell door. I didn't see what happened next, I only heard it. Kel looked directly at the comms by the door and said very loudly, "Who are you?" And Mori punched the code and the cell walls opened up to space. No sound from the comms. The atmosphere on the planet was not survivable. Elysium's cameras followed the orange dot of Kel's suit as it whirled over the sands and settled as a speck on a soft, cold dune very far away. I thought for a moment he moved or was trying to get up, but it was wind. Wind had formed the dunes. Now the orange speck rose slightly and drifted down. The sand rolled and took the drop of the color into itself, the planet daubing over one more extra detail. Mori shut the cell, and the air began to whir through the comms once more, the white static rushing in to displace the quiet. "Hello?" She tapped the comm. "Dolly? Are you there?" I was there, but I felt jittery, like I'd been cut loose from myself and Elysium's engine had started shuddering through the ship's core. Yes, I said. My voice seemed tinnier than before, a touch of a groan. I'm here. What happened? Passenger decided to walk, Mori said. I gave him a suit. He'll radio his position to the nearest Canarian ship, see if they can get him to a station. Is he in trouble? Oh, we'll ask Hearth if we can help. Her voice was high and cheery. For a moment, I was afraid she recognized her tone in my own, that we were pretending together, with Elysium as witness, that Kel had left because he missed home. And I remember that Mori and I had lied to each other before. I told her that I couldn't hear Elysium in the fuel room once as a joke, and when she searched through the machinery to check, I'd locked the room behind her with the strongest magnet Elysium had. She'd pounded on the door until her fists were swollen. She said later on, laughing with Hearth, "Good thing I let her out." But that hadn't been the case. As soon as Hearth started asking where she was, the magnet undid itself, and Mori walked out of the room. She told him she had locked herself in by mistake. Another lie. I was sure one day she'd tell the truth, even waited for it, but long after she decided to keep the secret, I felt loaded, aching shame in my heart for what I'd done, and a fear of what I'd find in the fuel room if I checked the magnets again, or went inside. Elysium, I said quietly as Mori locked down the cells. Elysium, are you there? Did you see what happened? The ship cruised through the dark. I felt a placid calm where I was perched in the cockpit, though I was sure I was dreaming already. I whispered into the microphone. Mori lied to me. You won't tell her that I know, right? Elysium wouldn't tell. She was mine, and I was hers, and Carnarian ships don't leave their pilots behind. If Kel was still somewhere out there, a ship might have landed in search of where he'd fallen. All the while, we never checked if another ship had followed us through the stars, but Hearth always assumed their craft was dead, which it was, and that the passengers needed a flight more than they needed anything else. He was right about the first part, wrong about the rest. After Kel's death, Hearth arrived a week later with the right kind of ore. Morty and I settled into the cockpit and got Elysium going, as Hearth unpacked in his room, and we both made conversation with each other as he slept. It seemed best not to arouse suspicion. Morty certainly suspected what I'd seen, but she didn't show it. I brought up the topic of paints as a joke, said if we could stop by a station for fun, we could tag the hull of the ship overnight and surprise Hearth with a mural. Morty laughed and suggested that we store the canisters in her room. I thought it was over then. I could believe that we had time for paint. We went a few more months in space before we arrived in the orbit of the station again. As the life ship rose around to face us, a message came in from the other cell. "We're getting a radio in," Hearth said. "Maybe we drop her off soon." That's how I knew the pilot would talk. She would have to give the coordinates to her location. This time, Hearth went down together with Morty. I drowsed back at the cockpit with Elysium, who, by now, spent most of her time sleeping, though occasionally the engine and heart would come rumbling to slow life, a faint suggestion that the ship still wanted to listen to us and still could. I dreamed again, of water like paint, of Carnarian gods who drank oceans, and of beginnings and of junkyard ships found chained together alone in space. Then the alarm sounded. It blared loud and red and bright, and the comms crackling to static and quickly clearing themselves up. "Dolly," Hearth's voice said. "Dolly, we've been attacked. Start the ship immediately." Attack meant damaged. Attacked meant an enemy crew, but as Elysium's cameras glanced around, I didn't see any ships latched onto us, parasites burrowing into flesh. "Turn off all the comms," Morty shouted. Her voice had gone high and frantic even through the static, and suddenly I realized that both of them were lying. The pilot had escaped. She had tricked Hearth or Morty and had thrown open the window to her cold white cell, climbed out, and was sprinting through the deep corridors of the ship and toward the cockpit. She didn't make any noise as she ran. I hadn't yet closed all the important doors. Around her, the ship shivered and slept, and I could feel the running through my chest. Every step a full and thuddering heartbeat, and every clang of a door ringing through my bones. I see now that she'd set her goal long ago because the way she ran was instinct, or maybe the product of years of training. She knew Elysium inside and out. Maybe Kel had fed her information, or maybe it was because she was a real pilot. I saw her heat signature blinking on our maps like a miniature sun. It dimmed as she scrambled past comms and ripped them out of the walls in bursts of static. The receivers crashed to darkness one by one, and she made her path to the ship's cockpit as surely as truth, even though she was a stranger. Just a stranger, and Elysium didn't even know her name. I waited in the cockpit, frozen from fear. Morty had taken full control of the comms now, still shouting and pleading, but Hearth's voice had gone silent. He had left the cells and started running too, following the same path. The pilot thundered down the cold metal halls. I could hear her coming, and I had no doubt that if she got to the controls, she would certainly destroy Elysium completely. Then Hearth's work, Morty's work, my work, years of hauling cargo and scavenging would be completely gone. And we'd be adrift in space, passengers to another wandering ship. We would never come back. The pilot ran down the corridors and staggered through the sharp turn and through the cockpit door, and Morty banged on the comms and shouted, "Stop her, Elysium!" And I don't know how or why I did it, but instead of shutting down the ship, I activated the magnets and locked the pilot in. The pilot sat down and strapped herself into the captain's seat, and adjusted the comms and asked harshly, "Who are you?" I didn't know how to answer. Elysium was waking up slow at the onslaught of the question. "Dolly. I'm Dolly." "Dolly." the pilot said. She had a very low yet shaky voice. Is that really your name? Elysium hummed from below the decks. The pilot had jammed some doors on her escape up. Morty was still trapped below in the cells, though Hearth might have made it through. I'm the third crew member, I said. I'm the third point on the Canarian star, the pilot and co-pilot. You're not. I am, I said. I am. No, the pilot said. She had flipped the engine switch and begun to read the dials on the control panel. She wasn't paying any attention to me now. I was a done deal. You're telling a story. And that's all it is, Elysium. And you're a long way from home. That's the ship's name, not mine. Elysium, the pilot said. Do you understand? The thing about understanding is that you have to make a cavity to wait for the truth. A truth was that Hearth was talking through the comms in his ear, except that his voice had taken on a pleading tone. A truth was that Morty's paranoia was fading at last into panic, as it should have long ago. I don't know if I'm capable of crying. I shut off the comm so I wouldn't hear Morty talking to me. I didn't want to listen to her anymore, or to Hearth, who was just outside the cockpit and had begun to rattle the lock. Hearth, Morty, Elysium. I didn't know why I hated lies so much. Elysium groaned and trembled and shook. It wanted to take off and leap out of orbit forever. Beyond us, the planet side of the life ship ahead turned its green edge against the faraway suns. I tried to speak, but could not. Elysium, the pilot said again. I'm going to vent the ship, and then we'll leave this behind. Make something up for yourself, tell a lie that none of this happened, or that it was necessary that Kella died, or perhaps a mistake, or even murder. You're coming home. Then she engaged the airlock and shunted the air from the ship. I didn't see Hearth or Morty in the black. I didn't see the pilot fire up the engines either, only felt it in the way I felt the airlocks of the ship slip back shut. The cells were empty and clean and white. I don't know why I keep thinking of them, or that moment. I know half of it was all made up, or at least most of it was. That's what I keep telling myself. Later on, I asked the pilot where we were going. She had slumped over the seat of the cockpit to sleep, and when she woke up again, she rose slowly, hesitantly. She hadn't rested well in months. I had listened to her heartbeat during the entire time she was imprisoned, the way I'd listened to Morty's, Hearth's, the ship's, my own. I'm going back to the colony, she told me. I won't force it if you need time. We'll be waiting when you're ready. I told her I'd think it through. The pilot understood. She made her way down to the wide, round escape pods, and I keep thinking I could have ruined her airlock if I wanted to. Introduced another gap that would open her up to the dark. Morty had once promised to paint the gating, the corridors around it, but that wasn't true. We never did buy any paint. I can't regret things that are past. Slowly, the escape pod unlatched itself from Elysium and made its way to another orbit. I watched the speck drift away, as if buoyed by the wind. That was months ago now, or years. But maybe that's all a lie, too. Sometimes when the orbits grow long, Hearth sits down in the cockpit and tells me that it's time to make up some riddles again. Some other nights, Morty brings me to her room and tells lies about how Carnarian ships operate on stories, that a ship is dead and gone without its crew, but the lies hurt too much to linger on them. It makes my heart break. So I'm trying to tell it all over again. Maybe one day I'll get it wrong enough to stick. I'll go up to the cockpit and announce that I've nailed it down, and Morty will rub her face and tell me it's the worst story she's heard. I'll believe her for a moment, but Hearth, who never lies, will listen to Elysium and the secrets I still hold. And think of it as beautiful. What are your thoughts on the story? You can send me an email on kate@clarksworldmagazine.com. We have a bunch more left for you for the month of March, so I do hope you'll come back and listen. And again, thank you so much for spending this time with me, for escaping the world and learning to live in a new one. I do hope you'll come back and listen, should you so choose. And until then, my dear listener, I bid you very fond and hopefully very temporary farewell.